All right, students, it's time for us to consider how scientists and engineers should ethically respond to a shit show. And by a shit show, I mean 2020. We will be talking about how to consider responding to a pandemic, how to engineer and how to engage in scientific investigations in a way that respects people's rights in a situation where there are very, very serious dangers to very many people because of a sudden new virus. So a pandemic presents a set of unique challenges. One is challenges having to do with scarcity, and I don't just mean the toilet paper situation, right? Or I was recently in New York, and you still couldn't get paper towels. It was very hard to find paper towels. Not that sort of scarcity, though that certainly arises, but that's not much of a decision point for those who are making the scientific decisions or the technological decisions. But scarcity is a serious decision point for them. So they have to decide who to test, who to treat, who to vaccinate, and I'll be going through these in a couple minutes. So let me just do the summary, the wide view of the unique challenges. Scarcity is one of the unique challenges. Public cooperation is another unique challenge. How do you get everyone to buy in to one united approach to the problem? Economic risks, that the economy falls apart when people stop working. Mental health and community stability. There's all these ways that people are sort of built to interact with each other and provide for each other's needs, and that gets interrupted by a pandemic. And then privacy and government intrusion, and that's some of the things that you've been listening to conversations about this week and reading about. So first, scarcity. Scarcity of testing. So early on in the pandemic, we had a situation where there were just not enough tests. And when you don't have enough tests, you have to decide who gets the tests and who doesn't get the tests. And the way it was decided was on the basis of having bad symptoms and being in high-risk groups. And that was a very narrow categorization. So I got the virus on March 15th, and there was no way that they were going to get me a test to see whether I had it or not. I only got a test about almost a month later through an antibody to see whether I had the antibodies. So tests weren't available to people like me in my 40s, reasonably healthy. They weren't available to, or they were only available to someone like my wife, who is still suffering serious effects from the coronavirus. She only had the test available to her because she's a healthcare professional. If she hadn't been, she wouldn't have had the test available. People who were older, people who were in nursing homes, they generally had the test available to them, but they were distributing tests on the basis of health outcomes as they anticipated it, without a whole lot of knowledge of what the real risk factors were. One thing that led to was that for a long time, until maybe June, we didn't have a grip on what was going on, how many people had the virus, how widespread it was, and who would generally get the virus, because people weren't being tested unless they were in severe risk. And that gives you very little scientific understanding of how the virus is working on a broad scale. So the question becomes, do you prioritize the public health issue, how to keep the virus from spreading? And that would mean testing wide cross sections of people. Or do you prioritize survival of the current patients? Now, Right now, we have a whole lot of tests, although not all of them come back quickly. In fact, if it were up to me, I would destroy all the tests in America that take more than 2 days to get a response, because it's less than worthless. You should just redistribute the tests that are quicker, because the goal of testing is partially to slow the spread. And that goes to another point about more how you choose who gets the test when there's a scarcity situation, because the more you can get people who are interacting in many different situations to be tested, that's going to slow the spread. But those people aren't the same people that are at most risk of dying. So secondly, we have scarcity when it comes to treatment. There's issues of healthcare rationing. This was a big deal in March and April. In March in Italy, and in April in New York City. Who gets treatment? Who gets the ventilators? How do you decide? What criteria do you use to say, no, this person might just be at too high of a risk for dying for us to actually give them the treatment that would most likely keep them alive, because we want to distribute it to a person who has a better chance to live. Those are brutal decisions in bioethics. And also, who gets scarce drugs? Because not everyone can get them. That's the very notion of being scarce. And so, do you give them to those who need it the most, or do you give them to those who have the greatest probability of survival or thriving? Thirdly, vaccination. Once we have a vaccine, who do we give it to? Do we first vaccinate the first responders, medical professionals? How do we keep the vaccine that we get from simply going to the people with the most money to give to the drug companies? How do we make sure that the vaccine doesn't just go to first world countries like the United States, like Germany? How do we make sure that other countries, for example, countries in Africa, would have access to the vaccine? Who makes those decisions? Is it free market so that it drives innovation, presumably? Or is it controlled by governments or by the UN? These sorts of questions become very critical. Also, when it comes to vaccination, you have the question, how do you treat research subjects, or how do you choose research subjects in developing a vaccine? And that question, there's a general way that vaccines are developed, and that generally medical research is done, where if there's any expectation that the person getting the treatment will be worse off because of getting the treatment, then testing isn't allowed. Well, there are studies going on right now that violate that general norm, and with a person's consent, the person receives a vaccine that researchers believe is as or more likely to harm them than to help them. But it advances our knowledge in building vaccines faster to give them this. Now, this isn't happening in a widespread way, but the fact that it's happening points to the critical need that people experience here, and the ways that researchers are trying to push ahead, even perhaps violating well-known ethical norms. But maybe they're not the right norms, as a utilitarian might suggest, such as Peter Singer. Now we have collective action problems. This comes in when we consider how together as a society to respond to what appears to us, at least in our generation, to be an unprecedented problem. What you might think that we need is a cooperative response where everyone does the same thing. And the theory was, and I mean, the theory is pretty solid to a degree. You can see it play out in New Zealand, although now they do have cases. That if you can just keep people with the virus from entering, and you can keep people at home and not interacting with one another, then the number of cases that there are will dwindle as the virus has no place to go because everyone's at home, essentially in isolation. Now, we never got even really close to that point in the United States in late March or early April. There were huge amounts of lockdowns, but they weren't very intense lockdowns. They wouldn't compare, for example, to the Philippines, where if you left your house, you could get shot. That's an intense lockdown. Also, probably violates your rights in about 10,000 different ways. But how do we get people to limit the spread of the virus, which will benefit everyone if the spread of the virus is limited? Well, you have to have a society where a lot of people agree. And in Western societies, where dissent is allowed and encouraged, and one of the things that can make our societies quite healthy, in this case, dissent can become a sort of obstacle, as we see in different cases of warfare where the entire country unites around one purpose. You could see this in 2004. Many of you were too young, right? In 2004, when we started the Iraq War, believe it or not, 80 to 90% of the country was in support of it. It was a massive outpouring of support for that war. Now, there's lots of people now who'll say, I didn't support it, right? But there was a massive amount of people that were supportive of that war as you come together for a sort of war effort. But when there is disagreement in society, when there are fundamental divisions, you're going to have a problem motivating people. Now, a step beyond this is what's called the collective action problem, which we could dispute as to whether that's occurring in the current case. But a collective action problem occurs when the best interests of each individual conflict with the best interests of the group. So, for example, if we have a pond and everyone, we have like 20 people fishing the pond, and there's a limited number of fish there, over the long run, it'll be best for us if we all don't overfish the pond. But in the short run, it'll be better for my business if I get more fish and I'm able to sell more fish. So what's really best for me is for everyone else to not overfish and for me to get more, for me to overfish, right? That's in my sort of self-interest, you might say. But since it's in everyone's self-interest to do that, then all 20 of us are going to overfish and the pond will be depleted of fish. Now you might think, why don't we all just not overfish and we'll all be better off in the long run? Well, if everyone else is not overfishing, that makes it all the more rational for me, myself, to overfish. So this is the collective action problem. What I need in order to protect my family from coronavirus is for everyone else in our society to be making responsible decisions about where to go and who to see. And if they do that, then it doesn't really matter what I do. Like, I could go spend time with friends. I could, be in all sorts of unmasked situations or whatever. But since everyone else is making responsible decisions, I don't get penalized for it because there's just less virus going around. But people don't cooperate well that way. And since it seems in the self-interest of myself to be more relaxed about the rules, it also seems in the self-interest of other people to be more relaxed about the rules. And that creates a situation where everyone acting in their self-interest hurts the outcome for everyone because the virus proliferates. And as we see it entering the winter now, or the fall, late fall, it proliferates worse and worse as time goes on when it gets cold. So, as I said, this could be a real or perceived problem, but I think there's something of this going on. The question is it actually in anyone's self-interest, even in the short term, to violate social distancing or stuff like that? That's a question. We could go into that conversation. But you get a collective action problem if it does seem to be in their self-interest, but it's in the self-interest of all of us to not do that, so long as everyone else doesn't. And another thing gumming up the works when it comes to public cooperation in the setting of a pandemic is the media. When we have different media approaches, different narratives being driven by the media in various directions, and without a real concern to tell each individual what the facts are. And this is something that people on both sides of the aisle are critical of, and perhaps both sides have a point here, that media is driven by partisan narratives, not so much by the actual facts of the case, which makes, so for example, people who are convinced that the coronavirus is overblown will be lacking in sensitivity to differences in the danger at various times of the virus and the way that it's spreading, because they could undermine that or suggest that it's not really the truth that's being put out there, that the numbers are being messed with in some way. Hopefully people aren't doing that as much now, but it was very common in April and May. But on the other side, people who are very, very cautious about the coronavirus could overplay their hand in that way and say that every opportunity is an opportunity to isolate more, to be around fewer people, and that can undermine the public cooperation, because in a diverse nation where people don't all agree on things, to emphasize more a approach that there isn't widespread agreement on can undermine the amount of cooperation that you had in the first place. And so it's a sort of balancing act, and the media's role is partially just to get good information out, which gets stymied by sort of various narratives. Moreover, economic and personal risks. I won't talk about this much here, but this is obviously a problem, and there's obviously a role for in particular engineering professionals to find new ways of making it possible for people to work and to communicate meaningfully despite the barriers brought up by the pandemic. So we see on the left, I want to just emphasize here the people going into poverty throughout the world because of what's going on and the necessity of isolating from each other or quarantining, or just limiting contacts, distancing, and all of this stuff. It's going to cost a massive amount of people their livelihoods. And this is a significant risk. I think that this is a risk that I don't know any solution for, but it's something that we should be paying attention to. And because coronavirus has hit the United States so hard, we haven't generally paid much attention to the worldwide cataclysm, both in terms of people dying and in terms of people being forced into poverty or very hard conditions. Also in terms of anxiety and depression. Look at these numbers on the right. Look at how many people are experiencing symptoms of anxiety or depressive disorder. This is a third of the population, whereas it was barely more than a tenth, 16, 18 months ago. But we really want to talk about privacy and government intrusion here. This is what some of your readings focused on. So how do we reduce the spread of the coronavirus? Well, we could, as it were, as sort of critics of the lockdown have said, we could quarantine everyone, which is, it's said that's something that's never been done in the history of the world, which is a slight exaggeration. But quarantine everyone, the sick and the healthy, to make sure that the disease goes away. But what you really need is to keep those who are sick from having contact with anyone else. And the very nature of this virus makes this difficult because the virus is, it spreads before you have symptoms, which is just a terrible thing for public health to try and cope with. But if we could reduce the spread of the coronavirus, if we knew the infectious people as quickly as possible and isolated them, or they isolated themselves. So if we could just identify those who are sick so that they could take steps, that would be a very effective thing. How do we do that? All of these have privacy objections that have been made to them. I have a close friend who is totally against traditional contact tracing. That is the government calling you up and saying, hi, where were you when you got the virus? Who else was there? And telling you to contact them. The government isn't even calling those people independently, though I think that might be a reasonable thing to do. But traditional contact tracing, to try and find where the virus is at a given time, who it's spreading to, so that you can cut off the next avenue of spread, so that you can advise people to talk to one another. By the way, if you get sick with coronavirus symptoms, talk to people that you've been around and then get tested and then talk to them again. At the very least, after you get tested and you come up positive, you need to talk to people immediately. Everyone that you've been around for the last 5 days. Okay? So traditional contact tracing is one way, sort of using phones, calling people, and checking on how things have gone. Then we have cell phone tracking. And technology they've been working on technology to do this, for example, using Bluetooth, so that one phone that had been near each other and that you find out that the person is positive for coronavirus, then the people who were nearby get alerted through this cell phone system. Now, this can be done in an optional way, which there are apps doing this right now in the United States and various places abroad. It can also be done in a involuntary way, where everyone's forced to have this app on their phone and it's tracked. I'm not quite sure on what the technology in China right now, but something like that has been going on in China. It can also be coerced in various ways, where you don't have to do this, but it's incentivized in such a strong way that you really don't have much of a choice. For example, if Google or Facebook were to institute this type of contact tracing, they could say, well, you don't have to agree to it, but you can't use our services unless you agree to it. And that is coercive, because it takes something that might matter a great deal to you, being able to use that service, and says you can't have it unless you do what I want you to do, which is something that is for the good of the public, but is an intrusion. And as I said, these intrusions can be through governments or through private companies. So we need to think about the notion of rights here. people have a right to privacy, certainly, from both governments and corporations. And this is a significant right that we have a lot of laws that protect, and it maintains your ability to develop your own ideas, your own approach to the world, and to realize that a government is there to serve the individuals that make up the government. The government is not there to shape those individuals. And so privacy is a significant factor. Now, certain encroachments on the right to privacy can benefit the public. Cases like this in San Bernardino, there were terrorists that engaged in a bombing. I don't know, this was like 7 years ago. And in the investigation after that bombing, they got a hold of their cell phones. But they couldn't get into the cell phones because of the encryption that Apple had put there on these iPhones. And the FBI said, Apple, we need you to create a backdoor to let us into these iPhones. And Apple said, no, we don't have the technology to create a backdoor currently. And were we to make that technology, we would be potentially compromising the right to privacy of all our customers. Now, there's a lot of controversy about that particular decision by Apple and whether it was self-serving. But you can see that the FBI thought that by tracking down who committed these terrorist crimes, we could get into a terrorist cell, we could figure out who was involved in that, we could arrest more people that were responsible, or we could question people, we could figure something out for the good of the public. But in order to get there, there had to be these violations of privacy, as Apple saw it. So here's a proposed principle to try and adjudicate this when we have situations like the question of contact tracing using cell phones. Here's the principle. It's based on an approach by John Rawls. A public safety intervention that violates an innocent person's right to privacy is only justified if there's evidence that it will improve the life of the individual whose right is violated. So the idea here isn't that this in itself justifies it, but the idea is that if it won't improve your life, if we don't expect it to improve your life for you to have this app on your phone that tracks where you are just in case you get coronavirus or someone around you does, if that's not expected to improve your life, then it's not permissible for us to put it in place. So this could correct certain, if we had this in place and we were confident in it, it could make sure that the government isn't just like spying on you and gonna go after you for something else that they find out through the use of your phone, or they're going to track your movements to, for example, this is a very relevant thing, perhaps track your movements to strategize for how to advertise in the election or how to persuade you of something in the election, which is something that a government could be prone to do. Now, I want to talk briefly about how various theories that we have talked about might pertain to this question of the coronavirus. First, the social contract theory. Hobbes' second law of nature says that a man should be willing, when others are so too, out of desire for peace and necessity for self-defense, to lay down the right to all things, and to be content with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. So the notion here with the social contract theory seems to be that if other people are to have, we don't think it's okay for other people to have this liberty. For example, the liberty to go out wherever we want when the pandemic is on the loose, or to do whatever we want when that's happening. So say to have a party with 40 people at our house. If we don't think it's wise for other people on the other side of the state or on the other side of the city to have that, then we shouldn't do it ourselves. That seems to be the theme from Hobbes' second law of nature. So I think that's applicable, and that sort of thinking is applicable. Deontology, second version of the categorical imperative, says act in such a way that you respect others as ends in themselves and never merely as a means to your own end. Certain types of vaccine research, as we talked about, that seem to violate this, where people, we don't expect things to go well for them necessarily, but we're willing to use them to help other people. So Kant would oppose that. Other issues, if we think about payment for experimental vaccines, suppose people are really struggling financially, and they say it's told to them, well, we'll give you $5,000 if you participate in this vaccine study. It's very experimental, and we think you might get hurt, but you'll sign off on the risks, and we'll give you your $5,000. That seems coercive. That seems problematic to many people. Now, others, devil's advocate position, would just say people are smart. They can decide what to do with their own lives. And if $5,000 is worth more to them than the guarantee of relative health in this case, then that's that. Virtue ethics. I have a list that I've made of virtues that might be relevant to personal decisions in a pandemic. I love virtue ethics, so I think that these are things that we should all think about. What's prudent? What's the prudent thing to do? What's the just thing to do? We think about how we can protect those who are in populations that are at greatest risk, to have a just response, not just a response that helps those who are already privileged. Patience, waiting it out, saying, dang it, this year is just gonna suck. But the more that people can be patient and wait that out, the better probably for all of us in the long run. Compassion, courage, and caution, those interplay, right? Maybe both are relevant, but they're at tension with each other. So what's the right way to relate to danger in this situation? And finally, to talk about utilitarianism, which maybe seems the most obvious fit in applying to the coronavirus. The utilitarian approach here is going to depend on the facts on the ground. We consider the welfare of everybody, right? Not just ourselves. Consider the pleasures and pains, or the happiness or unhappiness, the preferences of everyone, including people all around the globe, and determine a course of action based on what's going to be best for that large group of people, considering long-term as well as short-term welfare. One thing that isn't considered often enough in these discussions is the type of thing my wife is going through right now. Long-term serious health effects from coronavirus. She didn't die, right? But there are long-term serious health effects that can come from that. More controversial questions are raised by utilitarianism. How many people dying now could save those living later? Could we say, if we just make it so that we just flood the population, we just get herd immunity now, will that save people from having to socially distance? And is that pleasure that we could build up there in the long term through not having to completely transform our way of life, not hurting our economy, is that better off for us to just get it out of the way? That seems like, on a Kantian scale, using all these people who will get sick and die now as a mere means for our end, but utilitarians might be okay with that. Are there ways that we could manipulate information to lead to compliance? Could we lie to people in order to get them to act in such a way that's in their best interests? Right? Can we coerce social cooperation by telling falsities? That's a question that utilitarians might consider. And can we exploit people, or perhaps through the vaccines, to save multitudes of people later on? What are the ethics of those sorts of actions? Those are things that would come up, the uncomfortable questions raised by utilitarianism. So I hope this has been a helpful little exploration of ethics in a situation surrounding pandemics. Peace out.